She was traded away by her father, but in the rancher's silence she discovered fierce love. Bitter Creek, Kansas, late in the 1800s, and it rattled against the windows of the Monroe farmhouse like bones against glass. Inside, the kitchen smelled of stale bread and boiled water. Nothing more, for the land had been dry for months and the fields had given them little to eat. Jacob Monroe sat at the head of the table, his face carved from worry, his hands folded like iron over one another. His wife Mary moved slowly by the stove, stirring a pot that held almost nothing. Their youngest daughter Eliza swept at the dirt that would not leave the floor, her hair tucked into a braid, her face pale but not yet worn with age. She was 18, still carrying in her eyes the light of someone who had dreamed of something better. Jacob cleared his throat, and the sound carried like a hammer against wood. He said he had spoken with Caleb Archer. Eliza froze, her broom slipping against the floor. She asked if he meant the cattleman, her voice shaking, as if she already knew what his answer would be. Jacob nodded once, his mouth set firm. He said Archer had offered to forgive their debt, to give them a cow heavy with calf, enough to keep milk flowing through winter, enough to keep them alive. Eliza whispered, "At what cost?" though fear curled sharp in her chest. Jacob's gaze did not move from her. "You will marry him," he said, as though the words were already written. The room went still. Mary looked down into her pot, her lips pressed thin, her hands trembling as she stirred nothing. Eliza's voice broke as she cried that Caleb Archer was old enough to be her father. Jacob replied that Archer was 44. She was 18, and the law did not forbid it. The law did not matter, Eliza thought. It was her life, her body, her hope. She begged her father, "Please do not do this." But Jacob rose from his chair, and his words cut sharper than any blade. "A cow will keep your mother fed, will keep your brothers from starving. That is the cost, and you will pay it." Eliza turned to her mother, pleading with her eyes, but Mary only whispered, "We do what we must." Her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of years and sorrow, and Eliza knew then that there was no escape. The wedding came 2 days later. The church stood white and weary on the edge of town, its pews creaking as the neighbors filled them, their whispers carrying like snakes through the rafters. Eliza wore her mother's old gown, yellowed lace and faded ribbon, her hands shaking as she clutched the bouquet of wildflowers someone had pushed into her palms. Caleb Archer stood tall at the front, his black coat pressed, his face weathered and unreadable. He did not smile, he did not speak more than he had to, only gave his nod when the preacher asked, only offered his arm when the vows were done. The townsfolk whispered behind their hands. Some pitied, some mocked. All watched as Eliza, barely grown, walked out with a man who could have been her father, traded for a cow. The preacher's words lingered in her ears. "You may kiss the bride," but Caleb only bowed his head and led her out into the dust. Outside, a single cow lowed softly, tethered by the church steps, as if to remind her what price had been set on her name. Eliza lifted her chin, but inside her heart cracked. For a cow, her father had sold her, and nothing would ever be the same. The wagon creaked under its own weight as it rolled toward Archer Ranch, the wheels groaning across dry earth that split like old leather under the Sunday. Eliza sat stiff on the seat, her mother's yellowed dress clinging uncomfortably to her skin, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. Caleb Archer sat beside her, tall and silent, reins loose in his weathered hands. His black coat gathered dust, and his hat shadowed his face so that Eliza could not read him. He had spoken little since the wedding, not a word more than needed, and the silence between them felt heavier than the dry Kansas sky. The ranch appeared at last, from behind a ridge, a broad spread of land marked by a stone house that stood stark against the fields. Its walls were gray, its shutters faded, its roof patched with tin, and yet it stood firm, a thing built to last. A barn leaned slightly to one side, fences stretched out in crooked lines across the pasture, and the sound of cattle carried faintly on the wind. To Eliza, it felt less like a home, and more like a fortress, hard and hollow, a place where laughter had long ago fled. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard, dismounted with a steady movement, and reached for her hand. His touch was rough, his palm calloused, but his grip was steady as he helped her down. He said nothing, only gave a small nod toward the steps of the house, then turned to lead the horse to the barn. Eliza stood in the yard, the dust swirling around her skirts, staring at the house that now belonged to her and yet felt like the walls of a prison. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke and polish. The floors were swept too clean, the furniture set neat as though no one dared disturb it. No pictures hung on the walls, no flowers softened the edges, no music or laughter filled the halls. Each room seemed to hold its breath. Caleb walked ahead of her, his boots echoing against the wooden boards, until he stopped at a narrow door near the end of the hall. He opened it with a push and stepped back, motioning her inside. The room was small but tidy, a bed pressed against the wall, its quilt folded sharp and square, a table with a basin beside it, shelves stacked with blankets. It was not cruel, but it was not welcoming either. Eliza stood at the threshold, her hands curling against her skirt, waiting for him to say something, anything. Caleb only met her eyes once, then said in his low gravel voice that she would sleep here. He paused, then added quietly that she need not fear him, that he would not touch her unless she asked him to. His words were simple, steady, and without heat. Before she could reply, he turned and walked away, his boots fading down the hall until only silence remained. That night, Eliza lay in the narrow bed, her dress still on, her eyes wide in the dark. The house creaked with the sound of an old place settling, but beyond that there was nothing. Across the hall, she could see the faint glow of a lantern through the crack of a door. Caleb's shadow moved once against the light, then stilled. He slept not in her bed but in his own. Apart, a stranger close enough to hear her breathing yet miles away. The prairie wind moaned against the shutters, and Eliza turned her face to the pillow, her tears soaking the worn fabric. She whispered into the dark that her father had traded her for a cow. And now she lived in a house of silence, with a man she did not know, a man made of stone, a man who gave her nothing but distance. Still, beneath her sorrow, a single question burned. Was there something hidden in his silence, or was this all he had to give? The morning sun spilled across Bitter Creek, turning the dusty streets into streaks of gold and shadow. Eliza sat stiff in the wagon, her fingers curled tight around the edge of the seat as Caleb guided the horse into town. He had said nothing of the trip, only left a folded slip of paper on the kitchen table with a list of supplies written in his neat, square hand. Flour, sugar, coffee, nails. She knew what it meant. She was to ride with him to the store. She had not been back to town since the wedding, and dread knotted in her stomach like a stone. The wheels clattered over ruts, passing weathered storefronts with signs that swung weakly in the wind. Folks stopped what they were doing as the wagon rolled by. A man with a shovel leaned on its handle, watching with narrowed eyes. Women on porches paused their sweeping, whispers rising behind their hands. A child tugged at his mother's skirt and pointed, only to be hushed sharply. Eliza kept her chin high, though heat flushed her cheeks. She felt their stares like needles pressing against her skin. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Miller's General Store. He tied off the reins and climbed down with steady ease, then offered her his hand. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling in his rough grip. He released her without a word and stepped inside, leaving her to follow. The bell above the door rang sharp in her ears, and the scent of flour and lamp oil filled her nose. She walked toward the counter, basket on her arm, list in her hand, every step loud in her own mind. The store fell into a hush. A pair of women by the shelves glanced her way and whispered, their voices low but not low enough. "That's her," one said. "The girl married for a cow. Poor thing. Barely more than a child." The other laughed under her breath. "Or clever, maybe. She married a man old enough to be her father, and now she lives in a stone house." A group of young men leaned near the back wall, their boots scuffing against the floorboards. One of them smirked openly, his eyes roaming too boldly. Another nudged him and muttered, She ain't worth the price of a calf. Laughter followed, quick and cruel. Eliza's hand shook as she set the list on the counter. Mr. Miller's face was kind enough, but even his wife's gaze cut sharp from where she arranged jars on the shelf. Eliza tried to steady her breathing. She thought of her mother's eyes cast down at the stove, of her father's voice when he told her the bargain was final. She told herself she would not cry. Not here. Then she heard a voice she knew too well. Luke Carter stepped from the row of canned goods, tall and sure, his smirk curling at the edge. She remembered dancing with him once at a harvest festival years ago, when he had spun her beneath lantern light and whispered promises he never kept. Now his words dripped with mockery. "Did not figure you for the livestock type, Eliza," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. The store chuckled. She froze, her face burning. He leaned closer, his tone sharp as a blade. "Tell me, was it worth it? Selling yourself for a cow?" The laughter swelled, cruel and echoing. Eliza clenched her jaw, lifted her chin, and forced her eyes to meet his. "You do not know me," she said quietly, but steady. Though her heart pounded so hard it hurt, she gathered the basket, thanked Mr. Miller in a voice tight with pride, and walked out the door without looking back. The wagon waited in the sun, Caleb at its reins. He did not ask, and she did not tell, but when she climbed onto the seat his hand brushed hers, firm and steady, a small anchor in the storm. Her throat ached, her eyes burned, but she sat tall as they rode home. The whispers of Bitter Creek followed her, curling like smoke, but in her chest a spark flickered, stubborn and alive. The first nights at Archer Ranch were the hardest for Eliza. The house was too big, too empty, and every creak in the boards seemed to remind her that she was living with a man she hardly knew. Caleb moved through his days with a steady rhythm, working from dawn to dusk, his voice rarely rising above a few plain words. He did not tell her what to do, did not demand she serve him, yet his silence was so complete it left her guessing where she belonged. At first, she thought he did not notice her at all. He left the house before sunrise, his boots heavy against the porch, and returned only when the sky was bruised with evening. He would wash up quietly, eat the food she set before him without comment, then retreat to the chair by the hearth or to his room across the hall. Eliza lay awake most nights, listening to the low sound of his boots pacing the floor or the soft scrape of a knife being sharpened. She told herself she was invisible in his world, a wife in name only, a girl traded for survival. But then she began to see things, small things, that did not fit the picture of a cold stranger. One morning she found her torn gloves, the pair she had ruined, hauling firewood, neatly stitched and folded at the edge of her bed. The mending was rough, but the seams were strong, the work of hands that had taken care. Another time, a necklace she thought broken beyond repair appeared on her dresser, the chain repaired with a twist of silver wire. She touched it in wonder, knowing she had not told him of it, and yet he had noticed. The smallest gestures carried the most weight. One night, when the prairie winds moaned through the shutters and she sat by the window holding back tears, he came into the kitchen without a word. He set a steaming cup beside her hand and turned away before she could thank him. When she sipped it, her breath caught. Peppermint tea, the kind her mother used to make when the nights grew too heavy. She did not know how he knew, but the warmth of it loosened something in her chest. Eliza began to notice how he lingered just out of reach. When she bent to gather water from the pump, he would take the bucket from her without speaking and carry it inside. When she hung laundry in the dry wind, she would find an extra set of pegs left neatly on the line, placed there before she could ask. In the evenings, she sometimes heard faint music drifting through the hall. It was not from a piano or fiddle, but from a harmonica, played low and unsteady. She never saw him do it, but she caught him once on the porch, sitting alone in the half-light, his head bowed, the notes drifting into the night air like a prayer. She stayed in the shadows, listening, afraid to break whatever memory held him so still. She told herself these were only accidents, habits of a man too proud to speak. Yet the longer she stayed, the more she felt them shaping her days. Each quiet gesture, spoke more than the townsfolk's cruel whispers, more than her father's harsh decree. Caleb Archer did not claim her, did not demand her, but in the silence he offered something different, something she had not expected. He was showing her the edges of a heart still scarred, still guarded, but not entirely closed. For the first time since her wedding, Eliza lay in bed and felt a sliver of something she had thought lost. It was not safety, not yet trust, but it was the faint beginning of hope, carried on peppermint tea, mended gloves, and the sound of a lonely tune drifting under the Kansas stars. The days at Archer Ranch followed a rhythm as steady as the ticking of a clock, and yet Eliza found herself watching Caleb more closely with each passing hour. He carried himself like a man carved from stone, his voice few, his movements sure, but there were cracks that showed when he thought no one was looking. She began to notice how his eyes lingered too long on the horizon at sunset, how his hand would sometimes tremble when he set down a cup, how the harmonica appeared in his palm at night like a secret he could not let go. One morning, while she was putting away linens in the room across the hall, she noticed a drawer left slightly ajar in the old wooden armoire. At first she thought nothing of it, but something about the crooked angle pulled her closer. She slid it open with careful fingers, and inside she found a folded handkerchief, worn but neatly kept. Embroidered in one corner was a single letter, M, the thread nearly faded with time. Beneath it lay a locket, its chain broken, its clasp cracked. She lifted it carefully, heart pounding as she opened the tiny case. Inside was a sketch in pencil, drawn with tender hands. A woman with soft eyes and hair, pinned in neat curls, smiled faintly beside a child no more than 6, her missing tooth giving her grin a kind of joy that seemed alive, even in graphite. Eliza's breath caught. She closed the locket quickly, holding it to her chest as though it burned. She returned the handkerchief to the drawer, shut it tight, but the locket she could not let go. That evening, after supper, she found Caleb by the hearth. He sat as he always did, his long frame bent slightly as he sharpened a blade, the rasp of steel against stone steady and slow. The fire lit the planes of his face, casting deep shadows into his eyes. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, the locket clutched in her hand, before stepping closer. "I found this," she said quietly, her voice almost swallowed by the fire's crackle. She held out the locket, her hand trembling. Caleb's movements stilled. He looked at her, then at the object, and something in his face shifted. Not anger, not surprise, but a weight too heavy to name. His jaw tightened, his eyes dropped to the flames, and he said nothing. For a moment, Eliza thought he might send her away, might tell her she had no right to touch what belonged to him. But instead he set the knife aside and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The silence stretched long. At last he said in a low, raw voice, "Margaret, Clara." He did not look at her as he spoke the names. "My wife, my daughter." He rubbed his hand over his face, his shoulders sagging as though a burden too long carried had slipped. "They were taken from me years ago, by men I killed, but killing them did not bring them back." His voice broke, rough as gravel, then fell away to nothing. Eliza's throat ached, her eyes stung, but she said nothing. She only stood near the fire, holding the locket tight against her palm. Caleb leaned back, his eyes fixed on the flames, his face drawn with sorrow that no years could erase. For the first time since she had come to Archer Ranch, Eliza saw him not as the stranger who had bought her freedom with cattle, not as the silent man who moved like a shadow through his days, but as a widower who lived with ghosts. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters, she lay awake and thought of him kneeling at graves she had not seen, of music played into the dark for ears that would never hear again. She had feared him, pitied him, even resented him, but now she understood. Caleb Archer was not made of stone. He was a man with a past, and the weight of it was more than any silence could ever hide. The morning sky was pale as milk when Eliza saw Caleb leave the house without his rifle or gloves. His steps were slower than usual, his shoulders bent, though the day had hardly begun. Curiosity tugged at her until she could no longer resist. She followed at a distance, pulling her shawl tight against the cool air. The path wound past the barn, through a stretch of dry pasture, and toward a grove of cottonwoods that stood like guardians at the edge of the land. Their branches whispered softly, though there was little wind, and beneath them lay a small fenced plot she had never noticed before. Caleb stopped there, pushing open the gate with careful hands. He removed his hat and knelt before two weathered headstones set side by side. Eliza froze among the trees, her heart thudding in her chest. She knew at once who they must be, though he had spoken only their names. Margaret, Clara. She pressed a hand to her lips and stayed hidden in the shadows, watching as Caleb bowed his head. His voice was low, barely more than a murmur, but the silence of the grove carried it. "I should have been there," he said, his words heavy as stones. "I should have protected you." He paused, his hands curling into the dry earth as though to anchor himself. "I am not the man I was. I do not know if I ever will be again." His shoulders trembled, and for a moment he bent forward, his hat pressed against the ground. The sight twisted in Eliza's chest until her own eyes blurred with tears. She had feared him once, thought him cold, thought herself little more than a bargain struck between a father desperate for cattle and a man hardened by years. But here, in the shade of the cottonwoods, she saw not a monster, not even a stranger, but a man broken by grief and still bound to it. He spoke again, his voice raw. "I do not know why you were taken while I am left. I do not know how to live with what is gone." His hand lingered on the gravestone, fingers tracing the carved letters, as if by touch he could bring them back. Eliza turned away, unable to bear the weight of his sorrow any longer. She pressed her forehead against the rough bark of a tree, her tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She wanted to step forward, to tell him he was not alone, but something held her back. Perhaps it was respect for a grief too deep for words. Perhaps it was fear of breaking the fragile thread that bound them now. She stayed in the shadows until at last he rose, placed his hat back on his head, and walked slowly back toward the ranch. That night, as she lay in bed, listening to the wind scratch against the shutters, Eliza thought not of the whispers in town, not of her father's bargain, but of the man who carried his sorrow like an invisible wound. She thought of the way he knelt by those graves, his voice breaking for the family he had lost. And for the first time, she did not see herself as a girl traded for survival. She saw herself as a woman, standing on the edge of something she could not yet name, drawn by the grief of a man who had once loved deeply, and who perhaps might one day learn to love again. The drought had not lifted, and the days still dragged on with the same heavy silence, but something in the house between them had begun to shift. Eliza no longer felt like a shadow drifting through Caleb's world. She had seen him kneel at the graves beneath the cottonwoods, had heard the break in his voice as he spoke to the wife and child he had lost, and that knowledge made every glance, every quiet act, feel different. She no longer feared the silence. Instead, she listened to it as if it carried words too fragile to be spoken aloud. One morning she stood by the stove, stirring a pot of beans with tired arms, when Caleb came in from the fields. His shirt clung to him, sweat darkening the fabric, and dust covered his boot. She expected him to pass through without a word, as he so often did, but he paused. He set a small pouch on the table and said quietly, "For the garden." She opened it later and found seeds, wild roses, and marigolds, their scent faint but alive. She pressed the packet to her chest, her throat tightening. No explanation was given, but none was needed. The small gestures continued. When she woke one morning, she found her broken necklace polished and whole on her dresser. When she left gloves torn from carrying wood, she found them mended and placed neatly by the door. And when she hummed an old tune while scrubbing the floor, she thought she caught him listening, the corners of his mouth almost curving, though he turned away before she could be sure. The spark came in the simplest moment. She was working in the garden one afternoon, planting the seeds he had left for her, dirt streaking her hands and smudging her cheek. The sun was cruel, pressing down until her dress clung to her back, but she kept digging, determined to bring color back to the land. She did not hear him approach until his shadow fell over her. Caleb knelt beside her, his large hands brushing against hers as he set a canteen at her side. She looked up, startled, and their eyes met. His gaze was steady, quiet as always, but something in it held her fast. She felt the breath catch in her chest, the world narrowing until there was only him, his hands close enough to touch, his presence as solid as the earth beneath them. She took the canteen and drank, the cool water easing the dust in her throat, and when she handed it back, their fingers brushed. It was the barest touch, but it sent warmth racing through her. Neither of them spoke. Caleb only nodded once and rose, returning to the fence line. Eliza sat there for a long time after, her heart racing, the feeling of his touch lingering like fire in her skin. That night, when she placed supper on the table, she glanced at him and found his eyes already on her. He did not look away as quickly as before. The silence stretched, not heavy now, but alive, with something new. It was the beginning of trust, of hope, the faintest spark glowing in the dark, and though neither dared name it, both felt its warmth. The Sunday sun bore down on the dusty streets of Bitter Creek, turning the wood fronts of shops into walls of glare. Wagons rattled past, wheels squealing, horses tossing their heads in the heat. Eliza stepped from Caleb's wagon, with her basket in hand, a list of flour, sugar, and soap folded neatly inside. She held her chin high, though she felt every pair of eyes on her as she crossed the boardwalk. Whispers followed close behind, curling like smoke through the narrow aisles of Miller's store. She had learned to ignore them, to steady her breath, and keep her gaze fixed forward, but each word burned like cinders on her skin. "That's her, the girl he bought for a cow," someone muttered near the sacks of grain. "Barely grown, yet living in that big house." Another voice, sharper, answered, "Poor thing, or clever, depending on how you see it." Eliza's cheeks warmed, but she forced her hands steady as she counted out coins on the counter. The clerk avoided her eyes, his mouth tight, as though afraid of being caught on either side of the town's judgment. She gathered her parcels, basket heavy on her arm, and turned toward the door. That was when the voice came, lazy and cruel. "Well, well, look what the cattle dragged in." Luke Carter leaned against the wall by the shelves of nails, arms folded, smirk sharp enough to cut. He had once courted her, back when her life still belonged to dances and summer fairs, but now his eyes glimmered with a twisted kind of triumph. "Do you remember me, Eliza?" he drawled. "Or has life with the old man dulled your memory?" Her breath caught, anger and shame rising fast. "You know nothing about me," she said, keeping her voice even though her hand shook around the basket handle. Luke pushed off the wall and came closer, his boots loud against the floorboards. "Oh, I know plenty. You were a girl with dreams. Now you are a man's burden. Tell me, was it worth it, selling yourself for a cow? Or was it just a very good cow?" Laughter flickered at the edges of the room, cruel and small. Before Eliza could move, the door slammed open. Caleb's boots struck the wood like thunder as he stepped inside. Dust clung to his coat, his broad frame filling the doorway. His eyes swept the room once, then locked on Luke with a look that stilled the air. "What is going on here?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. Luke straightened, but his smirk faltered. "Just reminding your little bride where she came from." Caleb's jaw tightened, and he stepped forward until the floor creaked beneath his weight. "She is my wife," he said, his tone steady as steel. "And no one speaks to her that way, not while I am breathing." The room went still. Dust motes hung in the sunlight like suspended sparks. Luke tried to laugh, but it rang hollow. Caleb took another step closer, his eyes hard. "If you have something to say it to me." Luke swallowed, his bravado breaking. "I was only joking," he muttered, backing toward the shelves. Caleb did not smile. He turned, his hand brushing against Eliza's as he guided her toward the door. His touch was firm, protective, and though he said nothing more, the strength of it steadied her heart. Outside, the heat of the sun felt different, less cruel with him at her side. On the wagon ride home, Eliza looked at him, her voice soft. "Why did you come?" His eyes stayed on the road, but his words were quiet and sure. "Because I heard, and because you are mine to protect." Her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes, but she did not look away. For the first time, she felt not just defended, but chosen. and the spark that had begun between them burned brighter in the silence they shared. The sky over Bitter Creek darkened long before the sun set, the horizon swelling with a haze of dust that carried more than wind. Caleb stood on the porch of the ranch house, rifle in hand, his eyes steady as they fixed on the rising storm of riders, their silhouettes cut against the fading light, torches flaring like angry stars. The Delancey gang had returned, bigger now, harder, their vengeance sharpened over years of waiting. Behind Caleb, Eliza stood in the doorway, her hands trembling, though her voice did not falter. "What do they want?" she asked. "Water," Caleb said quietly. "The creek runs through our land. It's the last flowing for miles. If they hold it, they hold the town." He turned then, his rough hands cupping her face for the first time with a gentleness that broke her heart. "I need you to go inside." Her breath came fast, her chest burning. "I will not," she whispered fiercely. "You said I am your wife. Then let me stand with you. I will not run from what I love." Something broke in his eyes then, or perhaps something was rebuilt. He nodded once, his voice low. "Then we fight." They barred the windows, checked the locks, and stacked boxes for cover. Caleb sent the ranch hands to guard the barns, while he and Hank, the foreman, took positions on the porch. The air thickened as the gang drew closer, their leader's scarred face glinting in the firelight. He called out with a sneer, "Give up the creek, old man, or drown in blood." "Come take it," Caleb answered, voice like stone. Gunfire cracked the silence. Bullets screamed through the air, striking fences and kicking up splinters from the porch beams. The ranch erupted into chaos, fire bursting from the hay barn, smoke climbing into the darkening sky. Caleb's rifle answered each shot with precision, his figure steady as though the storm belonged to him. Hank cursed beside him, returning fire, the porch trembling beneath their boots. Inside, Eliza loaded rifles with trembling but determined hands, passing them through the window to Caleb. Her heart pounded with terror, but her hands did not falter. Then a scream tore through the yard. One outlaw had slipped past the gate, creeping along the side. His pistol rose, aimed at Caleb's back. Without thought, Eliza burst from the doorway. She threw herself forward, grabbing his arm just as the gun went off. The shot grazed the porch beam, missing Caleb. In the same breath, Caleb spun, fired, and the man fell to the dirt. "Eliza!" Caleb shouted, rushing to her side. Her body shook, her breath shallow. "I am all right," she gasped. "Only a bruise." His hands lingered on her arms, his voice breaking. "I thought I had no fear left. Thought I buried it with them. But I was wrong. I was terrified of losing you." The night burned with fire and gunpowder, the barn collapsing in a roar of sparks, horses screaming as men fell one by one. Still, Caleb fought, his strength renewed by her presence, his vow sharper than any bullet. By dawn, the Delancey gang lay scattered, the survivors fleeing into the dust. The ranch smoldered but stood, scarred yet alive, and in the ashes of the night's fury, something stronger than fear had taken root. The morning after the battle dawned quiet, though the air still carried the scent of smoke and gunpowder. Bitter Creek was hushed, as if the whole town held its breath to see what had survived. The Archer Ranch stood scarred but unbroken, its barn half burned, its fences splintered, the yard littered with cartridges and blood-soaked earth. Yet the house remained, windows cracked, but walls standing proud, much like the man who now leaned against its porch rail, his body bruised but his spirit unbowed. Eliza stepped outside, her skirt singed at the hem, her hands raw from the night before. She looked across the yard, where neighbors and townsfolk were already gathering. Word had spread fast. The Delancey gang was no more. Caleb Archer, the recluse once whispered about with pity or suspicion, had stood against them and prevailed. But the whispers did not linger on him alone. Eyes turned to her, the young bride traded for a cow, the girl who had been pitied and mocked. Now they saw her differently. She had not run. She had fought beside him. Women approached the porch carrying loaves of bread, pitchers of water, baskets of bandages. Their gazes were soft, full of shame and awe, their voices hushed. She stood with him. One murmured near the fence, Not a girl sold anymore, but his wife. In truth, Eliza heard them, though she kept her chin lifted, her pride stitched into the straightness of her back. For the first time since the day her father had bargained her life away, she felt no shame in the title of wife. She felt strength in it. Caleb moved through the day with slow precision, ordering repairs, tending the wounded, his hand brushing hers each time he passed, as if to remind her she was not alone. Each touch was a vow unspoken, each glance a promise she could feel in her bones. When the sheriff came to haul away the captured outlaws, he tipped his hat to Caleb with respect. But when his eyes met Eliza's, he bowed his head slightly. The town had changed its tune. She was no longer just the girl married off for survival. She was the bride of Bitter Creek, the woman who had stood her ground. That evening, as the sun painted the horizon with streaks of violet and gold, Eliza sat beside Caleb on the porch. The fields stretched out before them, scarred by fire, yet dotted with the first green shoots of spring. Chickens picked through the ashes, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Caleb's arm rested along the back of the bench, his hand brushing her shoulder, not in possession, but in presence. She leaned into him, her heart steady in a way it had never been before. "Do you think it's over?" she asked softly. "For now," he answered. His eyes lingered on hers, the hardness of his face softened by the fading light. After a long silence, he added, "I have never trusted anyone the way I trust you." Her breath caught, her throat tight. She reached for his hand, their fingers tangling together, warm and calloused, strong and sure. Around them the world was still healing, but inside her heart bloomed something fierce and undeniable. She was not the girl who had been sold for a cow. She was his partner, his equal, his choice, and he was hers. Together they looked out at the battered land, scarred but alive, and knew they would endure. Spring came late to Bitter Creek that year, but when it came, it softened even the hardest edges of the land. Rain fell steady for the first time in months, darkening the cracked earth, coaxing green shoots from the ground where fire and ash had lingered. Wildflowers dared to bloom along the fence lines, their colors bright against the soot that still clung to the ranch. Eliza knelt in the garden one morning, pressing marigold roots into the wet soil, her hands stained with earth, her hair loose from its braid. She hummed as she worked, a soft tune she barely remembered from childhood, and when she looked up, Caleb was there, watching her from the porch, his hat in his hands. He said nothing, but he lingered, as though the sight of her was enough to quiet something long unsettled in him. Their days fell into rhythm, not with silence heavy as it once was, but with the easy quiet of companionship. Caleb rose before dawn, his boots heavy on the worn boards, his shoulders broad against the gray sky. Eliza rose soon after, stirring the fire, cooking bread, and finding small ways to make the house feel like home. She sewed curtains for the kitchen window, and he hung them without being asked. She patched his shirts, and he wore them the next day as if they were finer than any store-bought cloth. There was no need for words. The gestures were enough. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the hills, Caleb came from the barn carrying something wrapped in cloth. He sat beside Eliza on the porch and unfolded it carefully. Inside was her necklace, the chain repaired with silver wire, polished until it shone. Her breath caught as he placed it in her hand. "I thought it was gone," she whispered. His eyes met hers, steady and clear. "I fixed it." She clasped it around her neck with trembling fingers, touched by the quiet weight of his care. She turned to him then, her voice low. "When my father sent me to you, I thought my life was over. I thought I had been traded away for a cow and nothing more." Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. But it was not an end, was it? It was a beginning. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, the lines of his face softened by the fading light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded ribbon, faded and frayed. "I kept this," he said, placing it in her hand. She realized it was the ribbon she had worn the day of their wedding, when she had felt more prisoner than bride. Her eyes stung with tears. His hand covered hers, rough and warm, and he whispered, "Not a trade, a beginning." She leaned into him, her heart full, and when he kissed her, It was not hurried or fierce, but steady, born of every quiet promise he had kept since the day they met. Behind them, the prairie stretched wide and alive, carrying the sound of new life across the fields. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to Western Love Legends. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Every tale reminds us that love can bloom even in the dust of the frontier. And who knows, maybe even Caleb might crack a smile if he heard you did.